Black racist kicks out. Warren Buffett from the restaurant. Turns out he owns everything of the restaurant. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Do you believe in God? If yes, like and subscribe. The restaurant was a picture of elegance, its polished floors reflecting the soft glow of chandelier lights. Waiters moved with precision, their uniforms crisp and their smiles practiced. Conversations from the diners blended into a low hum, creating an atmosphere that exuded exclusivity. The staff, especially the manager, took pride in the clientele they served, wealthy, influential, and, most importantly, people who looked like they belonged. Warren Buffett entered quietly, his modest attire and calm demeanor contrasting with the flashy appearances of other guests. He wore a simple blazer and slacks, the kind that didn't scream wealth, but carried a quiet sophistication. He paused at the entrance, taking in the room before heading toward the host stand. The host glanced up, her polite smile faltering for a split second as she took in his appearance. Her eyes flicked to the manager, a tall black man named Marcus, who was known for his strict approach to maintaining the restaurant's image. Marcus noticed the hesitation and walked over, his posture confident, his gaze sharp. "Good evening," Warren said, his voice warm but soft. "I was hoping to get a table." Marcus looked him over, his expression neutral, but his eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his tone polite but clipped. "No," Warren admitted, his smile unfading. "I didn't think I'd need one, but if it's an issue, I'm happy to wait." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice firm. "We're fully booked tonight. Perhaps you can try another time." Warren nodded slowly, glancing around the restaurant. There were a few empty tables, but he didn't comment. "I see," he said. "Well, thank you anyway." As Warren turned to leave, Marcus followed him to the door, ensuring he left without lingering. "This isn't the kind of place you just walk into," Marcus said under his breath, low enough for only Warren to hear. Warren paused for a moment, turning slightly to look at Marcus. His expression remained calm, but his eyes held a quiet intensity. "I understand," he said simply before stepping out into the cool evening air. Inside, Marcus returned to his post, feeling satisfied that he had upheld the restaurant's standards. He didn't notice the hushed whispers from a few staff members who had watched the exchange. To them, the man who had just been dismissed seemed vaguely familiar, though they couldn't quite place him. Little did Marcus know, the man he had just turned away was about to shake his world in ways he couldn't imagine. As the evening progressed, the restaurant buzzed with its usual activity. Marcus strolled through the dining area, his head held high, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. He glanced at the tables, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of imperfection. He prided himself on maintaining the restaurant's exclusivity, believing it was the secret to its success. At one of the tables near the center of the room, a group of regular diners whispered among themselves. They had noticed the earlier exchange at the entrance and couldn't shake the feeling that they recognized the man Marcus had turned away. "You don't think," one of them murmured, leaning closer. "Wasn't that Warren Buffett?" The others looked at her skeptically. "No way," another replied. "Why would someone like him come here, and dressed like that?" But the thought lingered. A few of the staff had overheard the conversation. Their curiosity piqued. One of the junior waiters whispered to another, "That guy looked familiar." What if it really was him? The whispers started spreading among the staff, creating a quiet ripple of unease. Marcus noticed the hushed chatter and frowned. "What's everyone whispering about?" he asked sharply, his voice cutting through the murmurs. One of the waitresses hesitated before stepping forward. Some of the diners think the man you turned away earlier might have been Warren Buffett. Marcus's face hardened, but he forced a laugh. Warren Buffett? Don't be ridiculous, he scoffed. Do you think someone like him would walk in here without a reservation, dressed like that? Please, don't believe everything you hear. The waitress nodded quickly and backed away, but the tension in the room remained. Marcus tried to shake it off, returning to his duties with a confident stride. To him, the idea was absurd. Someone as wealthy and influential as Warren Buffett wouldn't possibly blend into the crowd or tolerate being dismissed. It just didn't add up. An hour later, as the dinner rush began to wind down, a man in a sleek suit entered the restaurant. He walked directly to the host's stand, his presence commanding attention. The host looked up, her eyes widening slightly when she recognized him. It was one of the restaurant's investors, a figure who rarely showed up unannounced. Marcus noticed the interaction and hurried over, his professional smile returning. "Good evening," he greeted the investor warmly. "Is everything all right?" The investor glanced at Marcus, his expression unreadable. "I just received an interesting call," he said evenly. "It seems someone very important was turned away from this restaurant tonight." Marcus's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said cautiously. "Who exactly are you talking about?" The investor's gaze sharpened. "Warren Buffett," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "The man you dismissed at the door is the majority owner of this restaurant." The words hit Marcus like a thunderclap. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had just heard. That can't be right," he stammered. "He didn't say anything. He didn't even look the part." The investor's expression darkened. "He didn't have to," he replied coldly. "And it wasn't your job to judge him. Do you have any idea what kind of mistake you've made?" The room fell silent, the staff and remaining diners staring at Marcus as the weight of the revelation settled over him. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he struggled to find the right words. "I didn't know," he muttered weakly. I was just trying to follow protocol." The investor shook his head, his disappointment clear. "Protocol doesn't excuse arrogance," he said, "and it certainly doesn't excuse treating anyone, owner or not, with disrespect." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in his career, he felt completely out of control. Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, Warren stood a short distance away, watching through the window. He hadn't left entirely. He had wanted to see how things unfolded. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he saw the chaos his quiet departure had left in its wake. Calmly, he turned and began walking down the street, his footsteps steady and unhurried. The lesson had been delivered, and he didn't need to say another word. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was suffocating. Marcus stood frozen, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him like a boulder. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, and even the diners, who moments ago had been enjoying their meals, sat in stunned silence. The investor's words lingered in the air, cutting through Marcus's confidence like a sharp blade. "I'll handle this," the investor said finally, his tone clipped. "But you'd better think long and hard about how you've conducted yourself tonight." Marcus nodded weakly, his usual bravado replaced with a sinking realization. He had misjudged someone, not just anyone, but Warren Buffett, one of the most powerful men in the world. And now, his arrogance had brought the restaurant, his reputation, and his career under scrutiny. As the investor moved toward the exit, a hush fell over the restaurant. Everyone waited, holding their breath, wondering what would happen next. Just as the investor reached the door, it swung open. Warren Buffett stepped back inside. His demeanor was as calm and unassuming as ever, but his presence now carried a weight that no one could ignore. The investor stopped in his tracks, his face a mix of surprise and relief. "Mr. Buffett," he said quickly, stepping aside, "I'm so sorry for what happened earlier. Please, allow me to—" Warren raised a hand, his expression kind, but firm. "There's no need to apologize," he said softly. "I understand mistakes happen. It's how we learn from them that matters." He walked past the investor, his gaze landing on Marcus, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Warren approached him slowly, his hands resting casually in his pockets. The room was so quiet that the sound of his footsteps seemed to echo. "You must be Marcus," Warren said, his tone even. "I believe we met earlier." Marcus stammered, his voice barely audible. "Mr. Buffett, I didn't know. I didn't recognize—" Warren smiled faintly, cutting him off. "And that's the point, isn't it?" he said. "You didn't recognize me. But does that mean I deserve to be treated any differently?" Marcus's face flushed, and he struggled to find the right words. "I'm so sorry," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean any disrespect." Warren studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Disrespect often comes from assumptions," he said. "You assumed I didn't belong here because of how I looked. But you didn't stop to think that everyone deserves kindness, no matter who they are." The words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone in the room. Marcus nodded slowly, his head bowed. "You're right," he admitted. "I was wrong, and I'll do better." Warren's smile softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "That's all I ask," he said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do next." He turned to address the rest of the staff and diners, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "It's easy to judge people based on appearances," he said. "But true success comes from seeing beyond the surface. Treat everyone with respect, not because of who they might be, but because it's the right thing to do." The room erupted into applause, the tension dissolving into a collective sense of admiration and reflection. Warren nodded politely, then turned back to Marcus. "Take this as a lesson," he said. "One I hope you never forget." With that, Warren made his way to the door, pausing briefly to thank the investor for his time. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the restaurant felt transformed. The staff moved with renewed humility, and the diners left with a story they would tell for years to come. Marcus stood at the center of it all, his heart heavy, but his mind clear. He had been given a second chance, not just to keep his job, but to change his perspective, and for that, he would always be grateful. Outside, Warren walked away, blending into the city like any other ordinary man. But for those who had witnessed the night's events, he was anything but ordinary. He was a reminder that kindness, humility, and grace were the true markers of greatness. As Warren stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights casting a faint glow on the sidewalk, the restaurant behind him seemed frozen in time. The people inside, from the staff to the diners, were left reflecting on the night's events. For Marcus, the weight of Warren's words was heavier than anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just about his job. It was about the kind of person he wanted to be moving forward. The investor walked up to Marcus, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "Most people wouldn't have been this forgiving. Don't waste this lesson." Marcus nodded, his face pale but resolute. "I won't," he said. "I promise." Inside the restaurant, the staff began to move differently. There was a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet understanding that every person who walked through the doors deserved respect, regardless of appearances. The diners, too, seemed humbled, their earlier judgments replaced with quiet admiration for the man who had carried himself with such grace. Meanwhile, Warren continued walking, his steps unhurried, his hands tucked into his pockets. He wasn't thinking about the chaos he had left behind. Instead, he was focused on the simple truth that had guided him throughout his life. True power wasn't in wealth or status. It was in how you treated others. As he turned a corner and disappeared into the night, the ripple effects of his actions remained. For Marcus, it was a turning point, a moment that would stay with him forever. For the restaurant, it was a lesson in humility and the power of kindness. And for everyone who heard the story, it was a reminder that greatness isn't always loud. It's often found in quiet, unassuming moments that change everything.